We're going to get going. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. We have David Byler. He's a data analyst and political columnist focusing on elections, polling, demographics, and stats at the Washington Post. We're so excited to have you here. And so we'll just jump on in. So let's talk about Kentucky. Traders have Booker taking this primary by a pretty sizable margin. It's only expanded since this morning. And since this AM, Booker has claimed Fayette County, where Lexington is, and we're waiting to hear on Jefferson County, home to Louisville. With mail-in ballots, it may be a bit before we definitively know what the outcome is. But ahead of that, are traders onto something? Are you seeing other numbers that might indicate otherwise? What are you looking to see what might happen?
Yeah, so I think that traders are onto something in this situation. It seems like, just the way that the map's playing out with some of the things that you outlined with some of the, urban versus rural counties and what's come in and what's not come in and what the vote percentages look like right now. Just kind of my overall sort of gut level thing is that these numbers seem good for Booker. One thing that's generally interesting about the dynamics of the primary that also make me a little bit sort of bullish on his chances is that primaries are often fast moving in sort of the very late stages of things. So in a typical election, things are relatively stable because you can divide people into the camps of these are the Democrats, these are the Republicans, and you have just kind of like a base for people. There's less volatility in general elections than there are in primary elections, because in primary elections, the cues aren't as strong. You don't have something like partisanship that's strong that just sorts voters. You can have a candidate sort of change a bunch of minds really, really quickly. That's what happened with Joe Biden in the 2020 Democratic primary and sort of that, week-long span where he basically won the entire thing. And I think that that's sort of been what's happening with Booker. He's gotten a number of endorsements sort of late that signal a lot of support for him. I think the issues around protest and Black Lives Matter play into his favor, and he's hitting kind of, I think, a little bit of a sweet spot in terms of multiple demographic groups sort of intersecting in his favor. I mean, I don't want to jump the gun too much because there's still a lot of results to be seen, but him having a late surge sort of makes sense given the events that we've seen so far and the dynamics, just how primaries tend to work.
Yeah. And so, we talk about Black Lives Matter and sort of what has come from that. And you wrote this great opinion piece on how public opinion on policing has shifted. I really enjoyed it. If you guys haven't had a chance to check it out, we'll include it in the newsletter so you can take a look. I think we may have included it in the last newsletter as well. But in the piece, you discuss how public opinion and support for Black Lives Matter has skyrocketed. You note that support for gun control spiked after the shooting in Parkland, but returned to lower levels later. What are you looking for that might indicate that support for Black Lives Matter ahead of the election, perhaps like gay rights, which you mentioned, of course, in your article, is here to stay? And are there primaries or races that we can look to for that? Do you think Booker was a result partly of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, I think those are all great points. So, yeah. I guess I'll kind of work backwards through them. I think that Booker was certainly his chances were increased, and I think that by this issue happening at this time, I think this is one where he's sort of been on the issue for longer than a lot of different Democrats in terms of race relations and thinking about it and talking about it. I think this is one that plays to his favor in terms of knowing whether this shift is real or not. I mean, there's an obvious answer, which is time. And then there's a second answer, which is sort of like how opinion moves or does not move as the news cycle moves. And these things are tied up in each other. So with the shooting in Parkland, I'm going off of memory on this, but it was, if I remember correctly, it was about 30 to 60 days after the initial event. A lot of the sort of spike that happened in sort of favorability for, or support for rather, various gun control measures sort of had diminished, and it had gone back to sort of a previous level. So that I think part of it is just like the natural attention span of the electorate of people. I think part of it is also, does this keep up when the news cycle has moved on to other things? When coronavirus, fully sort of re-eclipses this, if that does happen. What happens there? What happens when it loses salience? And I kind of have sort of three mental buckets for issues around police reform and sort of race relations and whether these changes will stick. One is the bucket of parkland. It's possible that, this is a spike in support and it, peters out within 30 to 60 days. That's one possibility. And we'll know whether that's the case before Election Day. Second possibility is that it sort of becomes one issue in sort of a battery of issues that all function in a similar way. So the comparison I draw in the piece is to healthcare. One thing you notice in the sort of late 2000s is that enthusiasm for sort of healthcare reform is there. Support for the government making sure that everyone has insurance is there. And then essentially what happens is, in the period from 2009 to 2010, Barack Obama spends that political capital, gets the Affordable Care Act through Congress, and then suddenly the numbers on the ACA drop. And you get this sort of thermostatic pattern where, someone acts on an issue, they spend the capital, and then when somebody else acts on the issue, which in this case it's Trump and the Republicans in 2017, that capital can be rebuilt. When Trump and congressional Republicans tried to repeal the ACA, it kind of gained steam. So that's a little bit long-winded, but it's a way of saying that it's possible that police reform is something that sort of gains and regains and has an up and down pattern like other issues. Mm-hmm. And then if it's one of these issues that sticks, like same-sex marriage, I think we'll probably know within the next 4-ish years. It'll show up pretty prominently when one or both parties have presidential primaries and people start to take stances on it. I don't know, was that the questions? Did I miss some? Are there things you wanted to cover that I missed there?
Well, are there any primaries, I think, that you're looking forward in the next, 4 months that, well, hopefully we aren't doing primaries that close to the election, next couple months, that you might see and I guess the question at this juncture is what impact does this have on the election? Is it here to stay? Yeah. Can it sustain through the election?
So I think the protests, if I had to they hit sort of 4 months too late to have the maximal impact on Democratic primaries. A lot of primaries have already happened. Obviously the big one, the presidential primary, is already over. So on a number of the ones that I'm most interested in, including, this Kentucky Senate one, the cake is sort of baked. In terms of how it matters for the general election, I have sort of a couple thoughts. One is that race relations has consistently been a pretty bad issue for Trump throughout his presidency, even before, the most recent Black Lives Matter protests. You had things like Charlottesville. You just look at his poll numbers on it. This is not one of the issues where he functions well, where the public, likes how he talks about it. Yeah. So the longer that this sort of stays in the news cycle, the worse it is for Trump. I don't think we need to necessarily get too clever or try to, think in too convoluted a way about it. I think that's relatively straightforward. I think Joe Biden is also sort of if you're thinking things from a pure electability standpoint, I think he is willing to thread needles in ways that are going to help himself and down ballot Democrats. He's someone who, if you ask about defund the police, which, whatever you think of the merits of it, doesn't poll very well, he just kind of says, no, we're not going to defund the police. He's willing to sort of do the Biden version of triangulation pretty readily. So I think that if the Democrats had nominated one of their more progressive candidates who might have waffled on that or had trouble or embraced parts of defund the police, I think they'd be in a worse position. But this is kind of a feature and not a bug of the Biden candidacy, is that he's willing to triangulate and move away from positions that are less popular, but that the activist base likes, while still being left of center. So I think overall, on balance, this is an issue that, as long as it stays relevant, is helpful for the Biden campaign.
So as we're setting the stage, sort of where this goes, sort of to that end, we've seen sustained support. I think we just pulled up the markets that we had for Biden. Mm-hmm. And if we look at the 90-day, if we can scroll to that, we've seen this switch before. It switched, I guess, in mid-March for COVID, but we've seen a much more sustained support and a widening, and it seems to maybe have steadied out a bit. The New York Times and Siena College came out with a poll today with Biden 14 points ahead of Trump. when you break down the demographics of the poll, Trump's support sort of rests in older semi-white or white, not semi-white, white and semi-conservative and conservative voters. Is there a way he can shift this trend? Is there a way to create a bigger umbrella? Does he want to? Does he need to?
Yeah, so I kind of think of this in two parts.
Yeah.
It seems relatively clear to me that there are ways to create a bigger umbrella. A lot of those methods and ways were available to Trump at the beginning of his term. Some of them he's closed off now, but not all of them are closed off. So a little detail to think through sort of what I'm thinking through. So if we mentally rewind to 2017, there was a school of thought that what Trump would end up doing was kind of his own triangulation, where he was going to back an infrastructure bill and kind of chuck economic libertarianism and do a bunch of economic things while being sort of a traditionalist on a number of cultural issues, and that would be a very popular way to sort of broaden his coalition and do the sort of multi-ethnic populist thing that, you know, a Ross Douthat or a Reihan Salam would have dreamed about in, you know, 2007 or whenever their book came out. That option seems like it was there. It seems like Trump was either incapable or unwilling to take it. So in terms of expansion, I think one of the easiest ways that he could expand is just having the forces of partisanship and the forces of campaigning bring some wayward voters back into the fold. A lot of these 65 plus voters that seem to be really warm towards Biden have voted for Republicans before. I think that, you know, if the election sort of goes towards its natural equilibrium, if you will, I think some of those probably go back into the Republican camp. I think that one thing that the Trump campaign probably has its fingers crossed for is mistakes by the Biden campaign. It's, you know, stumbling into issues where Biden takes a, you know, relatively unpopular stance and gets tarred as sort of a far left-handed. I think it's harder to do that with Biden than it is to do that with someone like a Bernie Sanders or someone like an Elizabeth Warren. I think that one thing that could help Trump is if the news cycle moves in his favor. So this is disappearance of protest, which we've already talked about. Part of it is expectation settings around the coronavirus. So one thing about voters that I've noticed in like looking at the economic data and how that predicts elections is that voters are relatively myopic. Oftentimes they don't take like a summary judgment of the entire last 4 years of what's happened. A lot of the times they sort of check in and say, okay, how are things trending right now in this year or in the last couple quarters or something along those lines. And that is oftentimes what sways swing voters. So if Trump is kind of able to play expectation games and say, you know, okay, so the economic recovery is going better than you thought it would, and the coronavirus is going better than you thought it would, then that's a potential avenue to bring back in some of those swing voters, some of those voters who like Republicans in regular elections. I mean, if this is all sounding a little bit difficult, it's because it is. It's because like Biden is pretty squarely in the driver's seat in this election. You don't get a random poll showing you up 14 points nationally if you're doing badly.
Yeah.
You know, it's easier to describe the Biden win scenarios because if you just look at historical trends, he's in a better position.
Yeah, and to that point about historical trends, we had a trader write into us and say, you know, can you think of any elections where somebody has been in this position and lost it? Or, you know, I think the large question that I'm sort of seeing come from our traders, and I have, and I think a lot of people have, is can Biden sustain this, or what, you know, what can trip him up? He's obviously not gaffe proof. We've, you know, it's junk. But so what do you know, but within this political climate, do gaffes even matter anymore? That kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah. These are great questions. So off the top, I would need to have my like, you know, charts and spreadsheets and stuff in front of me to conclusively say off the top of my head an election has moved this much before or this much in the past. I think part of the reason this question is difficult is because I can think of elections where, you know, polls moved pretty substantially. There was a lot of wildness in like 92 with Ross Perot, you know, bouncing around in there. There was a really big polling error in the national polls, if I'm remembering this correctly, in 1980 with the Reagan versus Carter matchup that looked a lot closer heading into it than it ended up being on election day. I think, and this is, again, going off memory, so I might be getting the wrong one. I think 1952 also looked a lot closer heading into election day than it ended up being. But the issue with all those is that you have to sort of look further backwards in time to get to those elections. And there's an interesting debate around this, right? Because you could, if you had to argue both sides of it, one side would say that elections right now are just more polarized than they've ever been. And 2008 and 2012 are sort of relevant precedents, and the amount of volatility necessary to get Trump over the finish line is just a lot in our polarized environment. Another school of thought would say kind of that if you take a broader look at some of these other elections that have really shifted late in the game, that, Trump still has a chance, events matter, things like that matter. In terms of gas and whether or not those matter, I mean, I tend to think that the Biden primary campaign is sort of one of the greatest proofs against political gaffes possible, because he would just say stuff constantly and it just wouldn't matter. The national polls would, for the most part, stay where they were. They would respond to election results. They would respond to certain debates, kind of temporarily, but they just wouldn't respond to a lot of the day-to-day churn that happens. I would say that a gaffe matters when it is revealing or when it becomes part of a permanent perception of a candidate. So, when Trump says a long series of, wild things like insults Gold Star families, so on and so forth, in the 2016 election, I think those things add up to an unfavorable, perception of him that made that election closer and that's damaged him in the long term all the way up to this one. I think you could say the same thing about Hillary Clinton and sort of gaffes adding up. But I would caution against getting too caught up against one specific moment in a campaign sort of derailing a general election candidate.
Yeah. Well, I see some questions popping up a little bit about COVID. Obviously, pandemic still happening. So in May, you wrote about the grace period that the president had with COVID. We're in late June now, and we're hearing ominous reporting about reopening. New York, New Jersey just reinstituted their 14-day quarantine. Texas is seeing a real surge. So I think when you write in that piece, this message is simple. When Trump pursues an unpopular policy or mismanages a crisis, he tends to lose ground, much more so than when he behaves in ways that are personally outrageous. How does that factor into where we're going now?
Yeah.
And
so
will Trump be responsible for COVID, or will governors?
Yeah. So I'm thinking back on when I wrote that piece, and I was thinking about how COVID would play out, things like that. I had no idea the whole thing was going to get upended by, the largest mass protest that we've seen in decades. So that throws the calculus in that specific piece through a little bit of a loop. I would say, so one of the things that we see in the polling here, and also just in the historical polling, is that people like their governors, and they're willing to cut governors slack, and they're willing to give governors a lot bigger sort of thumbs up approval across party line endorsements, or across party line, thumbs down disapproval ratings. Voters are just willing to play sort of faster and looser with how they feel about their governor than they are with the president. I think so far, this has mostly been to the benefit of governors. At the beginning of the COVID crisis, you saw those sky-high ratings for different governors. So I think that people might take some of that out on their governors. There's a way in which that also, if that did happen, it would only matter so much because gubernatorial elections fall disproportionately on the midterms. So even if people take out some of their COVID, anxiety or rage or whatever emotion it is on their governor, their governor's probably not up for election again. I would say it's a bigger issue for Trump, and I would split it off into two sort of sub-issues. There's the sort of virus angle of it, of total death toll, and there's the economic issue of it, of, how long is this recession, how deep is the recession, how much does Trump get blamed for? It really seems as if the White House is focusing hard on the second bit of that. And I mean, I tend to think that just managing the crisis competently at the outset and getting good marks for that and not sending mixed messages and, taking safety measures and all of that. Like if Trump had emulated the governors more, I think his reelection bid would be in a lot better of a place. I don't know if that got all the different pieces.
Yeah. Well, and I think it also comes down to how do people balance it out. You talked about managing expectations. So you've got, the projections for potential deaths that they put out. And when you put numbers out like that, you can get held to it. So, what do those look like heading into the week before the election? What does the economy look like heading into the week before the election? And where do voters put their, base their vote based on that?
There's a couple,
No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say just a couple real quick things on it.
Yeah.
There's a couple things that I would watch. I would watch exactly what level of death toll sort of, and this is kind of a morbid way to talk about it. I want to be careful to talk about it because it's a national tragedy. But I would watch what kind of the baseline weekly death toll ends up looking like. Because as, whatever we think about this, I think that the American public is probably going to get used to a certain baseline weekly death toll and incorporate that into their expectations for the pandemic. And I think that the danger for Trump is a sort of second wave where that spikes again and people are like, oh no, he actually is handling this really badly. And that was, if I had to pick an indicator to say to the traders, that'd be one. But I'm really sorry. I feel like I interrupted you a bunch there.
No, you're fine. You're totally fine. We're here to talk. People don't want to hear what I have to say. They're more. That's why we have you here. I think it's probably also an interesting indicator if the more people know somebody who has passed from this, as these numbers expand that personal connection. So we're going to head into our lightning round, which everybody loves. And these are a lot of the markets that people have asked about, and we want to kind of highlight some that we haven't. We talked last time to Paul Kane, your colleague, about Iowa, on what's going on there. Obviously, you see on the screen a shift. Do you have any wisdom? What's your best guess on whether where to put your money on this market?
I think you probably, if you want to use the typology used by the Cook Politicals and the Sabato crystal ball types, I would put Iowa in sort of a toss-up category. I think obviously there's the survey data out of there that shows a relatively close race. There's also candidates that sort of betray their internal thinking a little bit. You have the incumbent there challenging the challenger to debates. That's an effort to kind of disrupt and change the news cycle, which means that Ernst does not, if you're reading the tea leaves, it probably indicates that Ernst does not feel safe, does not feel sort of there on this. One thing to remember about Iowa is that, it shifted strongly to the right in 2016, and Ernst did very well there in 2014. But this is a state that sort of has some elasticity to it. It's a state that was not nearly, as reliable throughout the 2010s and the 2000s for Republicans. It's one where a Biden-ish kind of candidacy, which is he definitely leans into his sort of like ruralness image. For whatever that's worth, that seems more likely to play in Iowa. Sorry, that was long for a lightning round.
No, you can please expand. I'm enjoying all of this, and I'm sure everybody else is. We've got some great questions coming in, so we'll also get to some of those. So the Massachusetts Senate primary in a couple months. A lot can change between now and then, but what's going on with Kennedy and Markey?
Oh, I don't know how to predict that one. I feel, like it's important to say what you don't know.
Yeah.
And this is one where I don't know. It's one that's bizarre, right? Yeah. Because, Markey doesn't seem like someone who should attract a primary challenger. I feel like if he was running in, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a different state that might have a similar political, trying to think of a good analog. I don't know if he was running in, I guess like New York, maybe like that. I would not expect him to get a primary challenger, but because like the Kennedy family exists in Massachusetts, he is. So that's one where a lot of my sort of fundamentals based thinking breaks down a little bit, and I just kind of don't know what to do with it.
Isn't that all of politics these days? No baseline. Okay, so we'll move on to Georgia because it's been an interesting case study in demographic shifts, as has Texas. What do you think the changes are going on for Georgia for Democrats in the 2020 in the electoral college? Sorry, I wrote like all of this like very truncated version of that sentence and I got it messed up. But what do we think is happening for Democrats in the electoral college?
Right. So one thing to think about with, if Democrats are winning Georgia, they've already won the rest of the election. That's kind of my basic line on it. I think Georgia is fun and interesting for people who are in this webinar or like, you know, happy hour, sorry, and me and you and all of our Twitter people. I think that if we're still talking about Georgia being like a genuine razor's edge state, then Biden has the other electoral votes he needs. I think Georgia is plausible. This is, so one instructive thing to do is that I think a lot of people probably maybe have done or have seen done who are here, is just if you look at the shifts from 2012 to 2016, everyone, you know, looks at, oh, wow, all the, you know, rural areas, there was this big shift from Romney to Trump, so on and so forth. There's also a large shift that happens in suburbs, in major metro areas. And so when Trump gained in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in states along those lines, he also sort of lost ground in these sort of under the surface ways in your Arizonas, in your Georgias, in your states that are traditionally Republican, but have just like major metro areas that are a little bit dominant in terms of population. So yeah, in terms of Georgia, I'd be interested in the Senate elections. I'm less interested in those than the presidential elections because typically senators do still have a small incumbency bonus. When I modeled out the Senate elections in 2018 when I was at the Weekly Standard, even if you confine your data to recent elections and take into account the polarization of this, that, and the other, incumbency generally is helpful. So if you think Georgia is going to be close on the presidential election level, then it's probably further on the Senate race election towards the right. But if Democrats are winning Senate seats in Georgia, again, then this election is very over. Yeah.
Well, same probably for Kentucky as well. I mean, if you're seeing Mitch McConnell fall. Yeah.
Yeah. Kentucky is one of these states that feels like you have excitement around it every time Mitch McConnell is up for, re-election. It's kind of this, I feel a little bit about Kentucky, similar, like I would compare it to Texas, but I would say Texas is a much easier get for Democrats than Kentucky on like Kentucky is much better for Republicans than Texas is, but it's a little bit like Charlie Brown in the football, in the sense that Democrats get really excited because it's Mitch McConnell and he's the Senate Majority Leader, and they think, oh my God, we have an amazing candidate, so on and so forth. And just the underlying partisanship of the state is pretty red. That matters in Senate elections. Yeah. And it's difficult with an urban-rural mix that you have in Kentucky to elect a Democratic senator. Democratic governor is obviously possible, but like Senate races are just more polarized to national politics. So yeah, didn't mean to preempt it if that was one.
No, it's great. Well, actually, I wanted to ask you, because you said Texas is probably an easier get. Could you talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
Yeah. So one interesting thing. So Texas, I put in a similar basket to Georgia in the sense that like it is gettable for Democrats in a year like this. If Texas is competitive or like is blue, then the race is probably over. Texas is a pretty misunderstood state, I think, because if you look at sort of the long-term trend lines in Texas, Democrats have been talking about flipping it for forever, right? When Obama first won in 2008, everyone was saying, wow, blue Texas, so on and so forth. But the underlying partisanship of the state didn't really start to shift until 2016. Essentially between the mid 2000s and the mid 2010s, the Latino population in Texas was growing, but it was sort of offset, I think, by white voters becoming more Republican. and the state just sort of stayed very red. In 2016, when Trump essentially gave away a bunch of suburban voters in an effort to get a bunch of sort of rural voters, whether that was his intentional trade or not, when he made that sort of trade, that's when the Republicans started to really hemorrhage there. That's, you know, if I genuinely think that if the Republicans had nominated someone different in the 2016 election, Texas would not have been so competitive in 2018. The map would look different. I think it was just kind of an air horn signal about where the party was going. And Texas is a wildly, or not wildly, that's an overstatement, but it's a highly urbanized state. It's a state where, you know, Dallas, Houston, Austin, the major cities really dominate the population, and where a lot of the rural areas are not fully empty, but they're a lot more sparse than the rural areas that you have in you know, other southern states or the Midwest, et cetera, et cetera.
So you would look at urban areas, but also then the suburban areas in Texas to see.
Yeah, kind of sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No,
one of my methods.
Nobody can actually hear each other on like any normal time. So you're not
Okay, thanks. One of the ways that I found useful to sort of analyze these, and I think this is a little weedsy, but one of the units that I like is sort of the CBSA area. So the Office of Management and Budget puts out these divisions that glom together sort of counties into areas that make up one sort of economic unit. So you have metro areas defined not only by the sort of core of the city, but also by sort of the people that work and live around there. And when you use that as your unit of urbanization, what you find is like clean trend lines that are honestly a little bit eerie on sort of a 20-year timeline scale. This was something I did back when I was at Real Clear Politics. One of the other people there, Sean Trendy, who I worked with, we charted out sort of the vote share across, you know, really big CBSA areas, like, you know, larger cities, you know, small towns, so on and so forth. And what you just find is between sort of the mid-Bill Clinton era and now, a like straight line Republican gain almost in rural areas. You find real gains for Democrats in major metro areas. And that sort of trade-off long term, it hit different states at different times, but it's now kind of hitting Texas in a way that's making it a lot closer than it was, you know, 8 years ago.
Yeah, we're going to have somebody, one of our traders, do something on that, Texas and Georgia. So maybe they can reach out. I find this stuff fascinating, so it's not that weedsy to me.
Right.
So I want to do a little weedsier.
Great, let's do it.
Last we checked, Michigan was polling, had Biden well ahead of Trump. Obviously, our traders have, is this Biden well ahead of Trump? The only polling team to get Michigan right in 2016 says that it's a dead heat in Michigan right now. What are you looking at in Michigan? Where do you land on the electoral college market and the Senate market?
Yeah, so I think on the electoral college market, it's hard to say that Biden doesn't have a large advantage there. I think that, you know, as just like a generalized rule, one pollster is like, just looking at one poll is not a great thing. I think that some of the pollsters, I don't want to like call anyone out by name or anything like that, because I just don't really believe in that for pollsters. But I think some of the pollsters who claim to have gotten it the most correct in 2020 oftentimes just have a very Republican-leaning house effect. And I don't know if it was, it's not clear to me whether it's, you know, a hidden methodological strength or a house effect that happened to turn out right this time that makes some of these sort of pollsters look good. I think that if you are seeing a 14-point margin in a New York Times poll, I think it's hard to look at that and then simultaneously say, oh, and it is a tie in Michigan. Michigan is home to persuadable voters. It has Obama-Trump voters in it. It has Romney Clinton voters in it. It has people who are willing to swing. It's, not one of these southern states that votes the same way no matter what's happening nationally. So yeah, in terms of Michigan on the presidential level, like it just makes sense to me that Biden would have a large advantage given everything else we know. Not that it's invincible, but it's significant at this moment. I would say in terms of the Senate race, this is sort of the reverse of the Georgia thing that I was talking about.
Yeah.
It's not as if Gary Peters is, the great star of, all of electoral politics. I would say that it's a case where you can imagine, the race being relatively close and Peters eking it out on some kind of incumbency bonus.
Mhm.
I think Republicans have about, the strongest candidate they can get there, which is good. But candidates only matter so much, especially in sort of this polarized time when the top of the ticket has so much volume compared to everyone else.
Well, and to your point about Michigan, there's obviously a lot of people who have a psychological sort of tick where they're going, I got it so wrong in 2016 that I don't want to make that same mistake again. So how do I look at this? So
it is hard. It is hard because not again, I don't want to call out any individual pollsters because I don't believe in that, but not all pollsters are created equal, and not every pollster that has polled Michigan has an amazing track record.
Mhm.
So I genuinely understand the sort of anxiety around that. Nobody, I mean, I covered the 2016 election as well. Nobody comes out of that election feeling like, fully confident and zero levels of anxiety about anything that they would ever project ever.
Yeah.
I would say that there are other states that have some demographic similarities to Michigan that kind of bolster the case that Biden is currently pretty significantly ahead there. One thing, when you're working with the presidential data and you're trying to see what forecasts what, is that states that are similar to each other do move together. So you can use the data in Wisconsin or in Pennsylvania or in Minnesota or in Iowa to make some kinds of inferences about what exactly is going on in Michigan. And right now that looks, again, relatively good for Biden.
Yeah. Last question, Colorado, do you have a take on the Senate race going on there?
It's not over,
yeah.
right? But like this is a state where I would be pretty shocked if Cory Gardner won this one. Does that
fall under some of the demographic shifts that you're sort of seeing? Yeah.
Bingo. Yeah. So Colorado is similar to Texas in the sense that a lot of people live in the major metro areas and the large rural areas are pretty sparsely populated. So a lot of Colorado politics is just the big cities that are there.
Yeah.
So yes is the short answer. But yeah, of the competitive races, I think that I would be the most surprised if Doug Jones won, and maybe the second most surprised if Cory Gardner won. But again, that take depends on how you draw the circle around races that are competitive and not, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But that is not at the that one seems hard for Republicans to hold.
Well, and then we're going to move on to our traders' questions. We'll get through these.
Yeah.
To that point about how you consider something a toss-up, what margin would you feel that makes the presidential a true toss-up?
If I had to pick one, if I had to just name a number, I would say like 2.5 points in national popular vote in Biden's favor in order to make the presidential election sort of a toss-up. I think if because Trump still does have an electoral college advantage, polling error, even though polls were really pretty excellent in the 2018 election, polling error absolutely still exists. We all learned that in 2016. And it would be totally, I would say that might be a good 50-50 mark. You can get into other discussions around, okay, what's the margin at 75, at what margin is it a 75-25 bet, and so on and so forth. I'd have to think a little harder about that and get some code that I'm working on running better to answer that exactly. But if I had to pick a 50-50 point, it's 3 points. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you can come back when you've done all that work for us.
Okay.
So we have another question. What factors would factor into Trump regaining steam in key states like Florida and Ohio? We have Ohio trending still pretty in the GOP's column, but our electoral college market has Florida trending D. So where do you think Trump has to do to gain steam in those places? Dramatically different too places. So.
Yeah. So the things that I would say that Trump would have to do to gain steam there, I don't know that there's a specific. So when we're talking about Ohio or we're talking about Florida, I think it's easy to get a little bit over specific in the analysis. I think that there are a couple things that would help him nationally, and that those things have downstream effects elsewhere, right? So one would be that expectation setting that we talked about around coronavirus earlier. One would be expectation setting around economics that we talked about earlier. One would be just where the news cycle goes and what stories are prominent after Labor Day as opposed to before Labor Day. Labor Day is the one in September. That's not Memorial Day, right? The one in September.
September.
Yeah. After Labor Day.
No time anymore,
Right, exactly. I would say that matters. Some things that some demographics that'll matter. I think part of the reason that Biden is competitive in states like Arizona and Georgia and so on and so forth is that long-term urbanization trend. Part of it is that strength with 65 plus voters. Florida is a state and Arizona are states that include retirees. They include people on sort of a wide, distribution in the age spectrum. These are states where that will help him. So if Trump does something that is able to repolarize voters kind of on age lines, I would expect that to be helpful in Florida and Arizona. I'm not exactly sure which issue he would use for that. The traditional move might be to try something around, Social Security and do a Trumpian thing where you talk in a populist way, but I don't know if that's really plausible after some of his economic policy within the first term. Maybe he's just able to do that around immigration and race and some of the issues that are polarizing everything. But that would be a demographic that I would say has downstream effects there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to move on to the next question. David, I enjoyed your series where you made a case for each of the Dem VP picks. If you were personally making the VP pick for Biden, who would you choose?
Yeah, so my answer would have been different a few months ago, pre-protests, honestly. I think if I had to pick someone, I would probably pick Harris or Duckworth. So here's what I would do if I was Biden. If I was Biden, I would probably vet multiple people, fully and totally, in the entire way needed to have everything necessary to pick. I would wait kind of as long as is possible to see how things exactly shape up and what stories are in the news cycle and or not in the news cycle. What stories or what policy issues seem to be most salient. I think Harris is kind of a slam dunk in the sense that she is a woman of color, and a lot of people in Democratic politics, especially in light of the protests, have expressed a desire for him to pick a woman of color. I think Harris, her shining moment in the 2020 Democratic primary was talking about race, was, articulating strongly held feelings that a lot of Democrats have on that issue. I think that she's sufficiently experienced. One thing that sort of faded into the background for the moment, but that I think probably resurfaces in the run-up to the election is the fact that Biden is not a young man. He's someone who is probably going to get more scrutiny, definitely from the media, possibly from voters, around who his vice presidential pick is, if that person is, in good health, able to, pick up the reins for the party at any time, has experience in Washington. I think that helps Harris a lot. Demings has Val Demings, the congresswoman from Florida, who's a former police chief. She has sort of a background that's tailor-made to this issue of policing. But I think that there is a vulnerability in the fact that she has only ever served in the House, and just conventionally, in a conventional sort of analysis of politics, people think of being a governor or a senator as being more relevant to the presidency as being in the House. That may be unfair. You can make all kinds of different value judgments about that, but I do think that's a perception that exists. I think that one thing that Duckworth has in her favor is that she just doesn't bring a lot of obvious negatives to the campaign. I think one of the rules in vice presidential selection is do no harm. It's that Biden is in the lead. He should, probably just try to play kind of a prevent defense. He doesn't need to, do anything that really shakes up the race, because the race is in his favor right now. Honestly, the weird thing about all this is that some of it's just going to come down to this like personal stuff that almost no one outside of Biden's orbit and the media figures who have managed to cultivate good relationships there are going to be privy to. It's going to be things that are decided partially on personal characteristics, on who he thinks would work well with him, things like that. I mean, I think Harris is the obvious choice, and it would make sense not to overthink it. But Biden is also thinking about governing and who he would actually want to sort of spend all of his time with, and that matters too.
Yeah. One more question that's kind of fun and in the weeds. One of the more interesting facets of the 2018 elections were the complete wipeout of Republicans in Orange County. Now that Mike Garcia has beaten, do you think that was a fluke and it may shift back quite a bit for 2020? What's the future of politics there?
So both, in the sense that like, I don't think that it was, I think that it's part of that broader trend. I think that 2018 was an excellent year for Democrats, and it would be normal to expect at some point some kind of mean reversion. And maybe that's exactly what we saw in the 25th district, and that's the sum of that story, and the mean reversion is over. What I mean by like mean reversion is that if you have like a really great Democratic year like 2018, you would expect maybe some of the people who had Republican loyalties before that to kind of come back, and for an election sometime in the near future just to not be so Democratic as the year 2018 was. But at the same time, like, I live in Los Angeles. Like, this is an area that I feel like I'm getting to understand better. And a lot of the changes that the Republicans underwent between the years 2012 and 2016 are just tailor-made and designed to hurt them in exactly this sort of area. These are the same changes that we're talking about that matter in Texas, in Colorado, in Georgia. They matter in Southern California as well. So, I think that I don't think that you're going to have Republicans coming back in the same sort of force as they were previously in sort of, the Orange County cradle of conservatism, et cetera, as you had before. I think some of these changes are probably going to stick for a while. And yeah.
Yeah, we'll come back in 8 years and be able to answer all these questions really well. David, thank you. I know we can get to every question, but we're taking up a lot of your time, and I could listen to you forever. Well, not forever, because that would be weird, but really, like, when it comes to all this stuff, so much insight, and thank you so much. And guys, thank you for joining us. This has been really, really, really fun, and we'll continue, hopefully have you back in a couple months and maybe have some more data. So. Yeah,
this was a lot of fun. I enjoyed doing this. I even have seen some of my like people who I talk to on Twitter like asking questions and stuff. So this is a lot of fun. I appreciate you guys having me.
Yeah, take care. Thank you so much again.
Thanks.